The warning sirens had been screaming across every city on Earth for 3 days straight, and nobody could sleep anymore because everyone knew what was coming. The Vexari had arrived. Commander Marcus Chun stood at the window of the United Nations emergency bunker and watched the massive shadow that blocked out the stars above New York City, and he felt his old bones ache with a tiredness that had nothing to do with his 63 years of age. The alien dreadnought was the size of Manhattan itself, and it hung in the sky like a wound in reality, and its surface seemed to move and breathe as if the ship were some kind of living creature rather than a vessel. Behind him, the room was filled with generals and presidents and prime ministers, and they were all shouting at each other about missile strikes and nuclear options and last stand protocols. But Marcus knew none of it would matter. He had spent 40 years studying every scrap of information humanity had gathered about the Vexari, and he knew exactly what they were capable of, and he knew that all the weapons on Earth combined would not even scratch the surface of that nightmare ship floating above them. The Vexari had consumed 17 civilizations across the galaxy, and not a single one had survived first contact, and the footage that had reached Earth from those dead worlds was the stuff of pure horror. Creatures of black chitinous armor standing 15 feet tall with too many limbs that ended in claws sharp enough to cut through starship hulls, and faces that were nothing but clicking mandibles and clusters of eyes that seemed to look in every direction at once. They moved like shadows given terrible form, and they killed with an efficiency that suggested they had been doing nothing else for thousands of years, and now they wanted to talk. The transmission had come 6 hours ago, and it was simple and direct, and it had made every world leader in that bunker turn pale with fear. Send one representative to our vessel, and they will discuss terms of integration, and no weapons and no soldiers, and just one human alone. Everyone in the room knew what integration meant because the Vexari did not negotiate, and they did not make treaties, and they did not share the galaxy with anyone. Integration meant absorption, and it meant the end of everything humanity had ever been or could ever become. The shouting behind Marcus grew louder as generals demanded they send a team of soldiers disguised as diplomats, and politicians argued that they should refuse the demand entirely and buy time for evacuation ships that did not exist. Marcus turned away from the window and cleared his throat, and the room fell silent because despite his age and his lack of political power, everyone knew that Marcus Chen understood the Vexari better than anyone else alive. "I will go," he said simply. The room erupted again, and voices overlapped as people called him insane and suicidal and asked what possible good could come from sending an old man to face monsters. But Marcus raised his hand and waited for silence. "I am 63 years old," he said, "and my wife died 2 years ago, and I have no children and no family left. And if I die up there, then humanity loses one tired old scientist and nothing more." He paused and looked around the room at all those frightened faces. "But if I go, and if I can understand them, even a little bit, then maybe I can find something that gives us a chance, and that is more than any of your missiles will accomplish." The President of the United States stepped forward, and she was a young woman with sharp eyes, and Marcus could see that she wanted to argue. But she also knew he was right. "What makes you think you can find anything the others missed?" she asked. Marcus almost smiled, but his face had forgotten how, because everyone else who faced the Vexari was trying to survive. He said, "And I am just trying to understand." 3 hours later, Marcus was strapped into a small shuttlecraft rising through the atmosphere toward that impossible ship, and his heart was pounding so hard he could feel it in his teeth. The shuttle had no weapons and no armor, and it was barely more than a tin can with engines, and Marcus realized that this was probably the most foolish thing he had ever done in his entire life. But he also remembered the way his wife, Sarah, had looked at him near the end when the cancer had taken almost everything from her, and she had squeezed his hand with what little strength she had left, and told him that the bravest thing anyone could do was to keep trying even when hope seemed impossible. He was not brave, and he knew that, and he was terrified in a way that made his hands shake and his stomach churn. But Sarah had asked him to keep trying, and so he would keep trying until his last breath. The shuttle entered the shadow of the Vesheri dreadnought, and the temperature dropped immediately, and Marcus could see the surface of the alien vessel up close now, and it was worse than the images had suggested. The hull was covered in what looked like scales or perhaps chitin, and it pulsed with a faint bioluminescence that made the whole thing look like some kind of deep sea creature that had grown to impossible size. A docking port opened ahead of him, and it looked like a mouth, and Marcus guided the shuttle inside and felt the clamps lock onto his vessel, and then everything went dark. He sat in that darkness for a long moment and focused on his breathing and remembered all the meditation techniques Sarah had taught him during her treatment, when they would sit together in hospital rooms and try to find peace in the middle of pain. Then the shuttle door hissed open and the smell hit him. It was rotting meat and something chemical and acidic, and it burned his nostrils and made his eyes water, but he forced himself to stand and walk forward into the alien ship. The corridor ahead of him was not built, and it was grown, and the walls were made of something that looked like bone and tissue, and they glowed with that same sickly light, and everything was wet and warm and alive. Marcus walked forward because there was nothing else to do, and with each step he reminded himself that understanding was the only weapon he had ever trusted. Corridor twisted and turned and climbed and descended, and Marcus lost all sense of direction, until finally he emerged into a chamber that was larger than any cathedral on Earth. And there at the center of that terrible, beautiful space she waited for him, the matriarch of the Vesheri. She was 15 feet of nightmare made flesh, and her body seemed to shift and change even as he watched, and her armor was black as void and covered in edges that looked sharp enough to cut light itself, and her face was a mass of mandibles and eyes, and she radiated a presence that made every instinct in his body scream at him to run. But Marcus did not run. Stood at the entrance to that chamber, and he looked up at the most terrifying creature humanity had ever encountered. And he felt his fear like a living thing inside his chest. And then he took a deep breath and walked forward to meet her. The matriarch moved like liquid shadow as she circled Marcus, and her many legs clicked against the organic floor with a rhythm that sounded almost like music, if music could kill you. Other Vexari watched from the edges of the chamber, and Marcus could feel their attention on him like physical weight, and he knew that any one of them could tear him apart in seconds, and there would be nothing he could do to stop it. The translator device, hanging from his belt, crackled to life as the matriarch spoke, and her voice was a grinding rumble that the machine struggled to convert into human words. "You send one old male," the device said, "and your species truly wishes extinction." Marcus kept his eyes on her, and he did not look away even when she lowered her massive head until her mandibles were close enough to touch his face, and her breath was hot and smelled like death itself. He could see himself reflected in dozens of her eyes, and he looked small and fragile and completely helpless. And he knew that was exactly what he was. But he also remembered something his wife used to say about fear, and how it was not the enemy, and how the real enemy was letting fear make your choices for you. "We are honored by your invitation," he said. And his voice only shook a little. The matriarch made a sound that might have been laughter, and she pulled back slightly, and her eyes narrowed as she studied him with an intensity that felt like being dissected while still alive. "You do not flee," she observed, "and you do not beg, and you do not produce the chemical signatures of adequate fear, and are humans defective in some way? We are afraid," Marcus replied, "and we are just stubborn about showing it." Stubborn, the translator repeated the word, as if it did not quite know what to do with it, and the matriarch tilted her massive head in a gesture that seemed almost curious. The other Vexari in the chamber shifted, and Marcus could hear them making sounds to each other, and the translator picked up fragments and words like strange and broken and wrong. The matriarch raised one enormous claw and placed it against the floor next to Marcus, and the claw was longer than his entire body, and it left grooves in the organic material as if she could cut through stone like butter. 17 species, she said, and 17 civilizations dissolved into our collective, and every single one sent their warriors and their weapons and their desperate final stands. She leaned closer again. They attacked us, she continued, and they screamed at us, and they died fighting or died running, and some begged, and some cursed, and some prayed to gods that could not save them. Marcus forced himself to breathe slowly. But none of them, she said, and her voice dropped lower, and none of them ever simply looked at us. Maybe they did not know how Marcus said quietly. The chamber fell completely silent, and even the wet organic sounds of the living ship seemed to pause, and Marcus could feel every eye in the room fixed on him with sudden terrible intensity. The matriarch was utterly still now, and that, somehow, made her more frightening than when she had been moving. How to what, she asked. How to see you? Marcus replied, explain. This was the moment Marcus had been preparing for his entire life, even though he had not known it until now. And he thought about all those years of research and all those patterns. He had noticed that everyone else had dismissed as coincidence. I have studied every piece of data about the Vexari that humanity could gather, he said, and your hunting patterns and your ship designs and your social structures and the way you move through the galaxy. The matriarch said nothing, but her eyes never left him. And I noticed something that no one else seemed to care about, Marcus continued, and something that did not fit the image of mindless monsters that the galaxy has painted you. As what did you notice? Marcus took a breath and prepared himself for death, because what he was about to say would either save humanity or get him torn apart in the next few seconds. You have never attacked a species first, he said, and not once in recorded galactic history has a Vexari fleet initiated hostilities with a civilization that did not attack them first. The silence that followed was so complete that Marcus could hear his own heartbeat echoing in his ears. Every civilization you integrated had already struck at you first, he continued, and they saw you coming, and they launched preemptive strikes, and they attacked your ships, and they tried to destroy you before you could reach them. And the matriarch was so still now that she might have been carved from stone. You are not predators hunting prey, Marcus said, and you are something else entirely. And I think you have been waiting for someone to notice that for a very long time. The matriarch made a sound that the translator could not process, and it was low and resonant, and it seemed to vibrate in Marcus's chest, and he did not know if it was anger or grief or something else altogether. Her soldiers shifted nervously in the shadows, and Marcus could see them looking at each other with what might have been confusion or perhaps fear of their own. How did you see this? The matriarch finally asked, and her voice was different now and softer somehow and almost broken. Because I have spent my life looking for the truth beneath the surface, Marcus replied, and because the surface rarely tells you what is really going on. The matriarch lowered herself slowly until her eyes were level with his, and this time there was no threat in the gesture, and only a strange and terrible vulnerability. You are the first, she said, and in 3,000 years, you are the first to look at us and see anything but monsters. Then I am honored to be the first, Marcus said, and I would like to understand more if you are willing to share. The matriarch studied him for a long moment, and then she made a gesture with one of her many limbs, and part of the floor rose up and reshaped itself into something that looked almost like a chair. Sit, she commanded. And there is much you need to know. Marcus sat down, and his legs were grateful because they had been shaking for the past hour, and he looked up at this nightmare creature, who suddenly seemed more sad than terrifying, and the matriarch began to speak. The matriarch settled her massive form across from Marcus, and as she moved, her body seemed to contract slightly and become smaller and less threatening, and Marcus realized that this was deliberate, and that she was trying to make him more comfortable. It was such a human gesture that it made his chest ache. 3,000 years ago, she began, and the Vishari were different, and we were not always what you see before you now. Marcus listened without interrupting because he understood that this was not just an explanation, but a confession that had been building for millennia. Our homeworld was called Vexa Prime in your translation. She continued, and it was a world of vast oceans and floating forests and crystalline mountains that sang. When the wind passed through them, she paused, and her many eyes seemed to look at something far away that only she could see. We were small then, she said, and soft and fragile, and we had no claws and no armor and no weapons built into our flesh. And we were builders and artists and dreamers, and we thought the universe was beautiful, and we wanted to share that beauty with everyone we met. Marcus tried to imagine it, and he pictured creatures that looked nothing like the monster before him. And he wondered what could possibly transform a species so completely. Then the Kethray came, she said, and the word came out like poison. Who were they? Marcus asked quietly. The Kethray were ancient when we were young, she replied, and they were elegant and sleek, and their technology was beyond anything we could comprehend, and they moved through the galaxy taking whatever they wanted, because no one could stop them. She unfolded one massive claw and held it before her own face and studied it as if seeing it for the first time. They saw, she continued, and they saw small soft creatures who built beautiful things and who had no way to defend themselves, and they decided that we would make excellent livestock. The word hit Marcus like a punch to the gut, and he felt sick as he began to understand where this story was going. They captured our entire species, she said, and they bred us in pens like animals, and they fed us to their young as living meals because they found our fear delicious, and they experimented on us to make us more nutritious and more flavorful and more terrified. Marcus closed his eyes for a moment and thought about all the horrors humanity had inflicted on itself throughout history, and he realized that the universe was even crueler than he had imagined. For 600 years we were nothing but food, she continued, in generation after generation. We were born into cages and raised for slaughter, and we had no hope and no future and no chance of escape. Then how did you survive? Marcus asked. We evolved, she said, and the word came out like a curse, and we forced ourselves to evolve because evolution was too slow, and we needed to change now or we would be prey forever. She stood suddenly, and her full height was terrifying again. But this time, Marcus understood that the terror was the point. Each generation we selected for size, she said, and we selected for armor, and we selected for claws, and for speed, and for strength, and we taught our children to be killers before they could walk, and we bred fear into our very bones so that we would never forget what we had been. Her voice grew harder. We became what we needed to become, she said, and we turned ourselves into nightmares because nightmares do not get eaten, and nightmares do not cower in cages, and nightmares fight back. What happened to the Kethray? Marcus asked, even though he already knew the answer. Gone, she said simply, and we hunted them across every world they had ever touched, and we destroyed their ships and their cities and their colonies, and we made sure that not a single one of them would ever threaten anyone again. She lowered herself back down, and her voice became soft once more. But by the time we were strong enough to fight back, we had forgotten how to be anything else, and the fear and the rage and the hunger for safety had become everything we were. Marcus nodded slowly, and he thought about how trauma could reshape a person and how much worse it must be to reshape an entire species and every civilization that encountered you after that, he said. And they saw monsters. They saw what we had become, she agreed. And they did not see the pain underneath, and they did not ask why we looked the way we looked, and they simply attacked, because that is what you do when you see a monster. She made that sound again, and the one the translator could not process, and Marcus understood now that it was grief. We never attacked first, she said, and we always waited and we always hoped that someone would look at us and see past the armor and the claws and the terrible shape we had forced ourselves to become. But no one ever did Marcus finished. No one ever did she confirmed, and so we defended ourselves, and we destroyed those who attacked us, and we told ourselves it was necessary, and we told ourselves we had no choice. She looked at him with all her many eyes, and after 3,000 years, she said we began to believe that perhaps we really were nothing but monsters after all. Marcus sat in silence for a long moment, and he thought about his wife, and the way people had stopped visiting her when she got sick, and the way they had looked at her with fear instead of love, and the way loneliness could destroy a person from the inside out. "I understand," he said finally. "No," the matriarch replied, "and you cannot understand, and your species has not suffered what we have suffered." "You are right," Marcus agreed, "and I cannot understand your pain completely, and no one can truly understand another being suffering from the inside." He stood up slowly and looked at her without flinching. "But I know what it is like to be seen as something less than what you are," he said, "and I know what it is like to be alone, and I know what it is like to wonder if you will ever find someone who looks at you and sees the truth." The matriarch was silent for a long time. "Why do you not fear us?" she asked finally, "and why do you look at me as if I am a person instead of a monster?" "Because you are a person," Marcus replied, "and you are a person who has been hurt badly, and who has been alone for far too long. And I think you are tired of being a monster." The sound she made then was definitely grief, and it echoed through the chamber, and the other Veshari shifted uncomfortably, as if they did not know how to react to their leader showing such vulnerability. "What do you want from us?" she asked, "and what does your species hope to gain?" "I want to help," Marcus said simply, "and I want to help you remember what you were before the fear." And for the first time in 3,000 years, the matriarch of the Vexari did not know what to say. The chamber was quiet except for the soft, wet sounds of the living ship breathing around them, and Marcus stood before the matriarch and waited for her to find the words she needed. He had learned long ago that sometimes the most important thing you could do was simply be present and let someone work through their thoughts without rushing them. His wife had taught him that during the long nights in the hospital when she had needed to talk about dying, and he had needed to learn how to listen. Finally, the matriarch spoke, and her voice was rough, as if she had not used it for anything but commands in a very long time. "Your species," she said, "and you have been prey as well." Marcus nodded slowly. "Many times," he replied, "and mostly to each other actually, and we have been slaves and conquerors and victims and monsters, and sometimes all of those things at once." He paused and thought about human history and all the terrible chapters that filled it. "We have committed horrors against our own kind that would make the Kethra seem merciful," he continued, "and we have burned and tortured and enslaved. And we have done it in the name of gods and gold and power and fear." "Then how are you still capable of kindness?" the matriarch asked. "And how have you not become like us?" Marcus almost laughed, but it came out as something closer to a sigh. "We did become like you," he said, "and over again we became exactly like you, and we built empires on the bones of the innocent, and we convinced ourselves that our victims deserved their fate." He looked at her with eyes that had seen too much human history, but somehow we also kept producing people who refused to accept that he continued, and people who looked at the monsters we had become and insisted that we could be better, and people who stubbornly believed in redemption, even when all the evidence suggested it was impossible. The matriarch tilted her head in that curious gesture again. "And these people," she asked, "and did they succeed?" "Sometimes," Marcus replied, "and sometimes they were killed for their beliefs, and sometimes they were ignored and mocked and forgotten, and sometimes they changed everything." He stepped closer to her, and he was not afraid anymore, because fear had become irrelevant. "The point is that they kept trying," he said, "and generation after generation. They kept insisting that we were more than our worst moments, and eventually enough people started to believe it. Why, the matriarch asked, and why would anyone fight for a species that had done such terrible things? Marcus was quiet for a moment, and then he spoke about his wife. Sarah was her name. He said, and she was a doctor who worked with children, and she spent her whole life trying to heal people who had been broken by violence and abuse and neglect. The matriarch listened, and her many eyes were fixed on him with complete attention. When she got sick, he continued, and the cancer started to change her, and people stopped visiting because they were afraid of what she had become. He took a breath, and the memories still hurt after all these years. She lost her hair first, and then her weight and her skin turned gray, and she could not control her body anymore. And some days she did not recognize me, and some days she said terrible things because the pain made her someone she was not. Why do you tell me this? The matriarch asked softly. Because I loved her anyway, Marcus replied, and because when I looked at her, I did not see the disease or the decay or the death waiting to happen, and I just saw her, and I saw the woman who laughed at my terrible jokes, and who held my hand during thunderstorms, and who made me promise to keep living after she was gone. His voice broke slightly. The outside of something rarely tells you what is inside, he said, and I learned that from watching the woman I loved disappear behind something terrible and choosing to keep seeing her. Anyway, the matriarch was silent and around the chamber the other Vexari were silent as well, and Marcus could feel that something had shifted in the room. You look like a nightmare, he said to the matriarch, and you look like every monster from every story humanity has ever told, and anyone who sees you would be right to be afraid. He met her eyes and held them. But you sound like someone who has been alone for 3,000 years, he continued, and you sound like someone who has forgotten what it feels like to be seen, and you sound like someone who is so very tired of being afraid. The sound the matriarch made then was unmistakable, and it was the sound of weeping, and it shook her entire massive form, and the other Vexari shifted uncomfortably, as if they had never seen their leader like this. What do you offer us? She finally managed, and what could your small, fragile species possibly give the Vexari? Marcus smiled, and it was the first real smile he had managed since Sarah died, something no one else has offered you in 3,000 years, he said. What? A chance to remember what you were before the fear, he replied, and a chance to learn how to be something other than monsters, and a chance to find out if the universe can forgive you, even if you cannot forgive yourselves. The matriarch stared at him for a long time. And if we cannot change, she asked, and what if we have been monsters for too long? And what if there is nothing left of what we were? Then we will help you anyway, Marcus said, and because that is what you do for family. Family, she repeated the word as if she had never heard it before. Family, he confirmed, and the messy, broken, complicated kind of family that fights and hurts each other and makes terrible mistakes and somehow keeps showing up anyway. He held out his hand to her, and it was such a small gesture, and so human and so absurd in the face of her enormous alien form. We are not asking you to be perfect, he said, and we are just asking you to try. The matriarch looked at his outstretched hand, and she looked at her own massive claws, and she looked at the soldiers, watching from the shadows who had followed her through millennia of blood and fear, and slowly and carefully, and with a gentleness that seemed impossible. Something so large and so deadly, she reached out and touched his hand with the tip of one claw. We will try, she said quietly, and we do not know if we can succeed, but we will try. Marcus nodded, and he felt tears running down his face, and he did not bother to wipe them away. That is all anyone can ask, he said. The matriarch rose to her full height, and her voice rang through the chamber with sudden authority. Summon the Galactic Assembly, she commanded, and all channels and every species, and they will hear what I have to say. Marcus felt a flutter of uncertainty. What are you going to do? He asked. She looked down at him, and for the first time he saw something in her eyes that might have been hope. I am going to tell the truth, she said, and I am going to see if the universe is ready to hear it. The chamber transformed around them as holographic projectors activated, and suddenly, Marcus was surrounded by the faces of 100 different species, and each one represented a civilization that had spent generations living in terror of the Vexari. He recognized some of them from his research, and the blue-skinned Thalani, who had lost 3 colony worlds, and the insectoid Crix, who had watched their homeworld burn, and the gaseous nebulons, who existed as clouds of sentient matter and had nearly been scattered to nothing. All of them looked at the matriarch with fear and hatred and the weight of ancient grievances, and none of them looked at Marcus at all, because what was one human in the face of such history? The matriarch rose to her full terrible height, and her voice boomed through the chamber and across every communication channel in the galaxy. For 3 millennia, she began, and you have called us monsters and devourers and the plague that ends civilizations, and you have been correct. Murmurs rippled through the holographic assembly, and Marcus could see representatives turning to each other with confusion, because this was not how the Vesari spoke, and this was not the arrogant dismissal they had expected. "We have destroyed your worlds," she continued, "and we have ended your peoples, and we have given you every reason to hate us and fear us and wish for our extinction." The matriarch paused, and her many eyes swept across the assembled representatives. "But today something happened that has not happened in 3,000 years," she said, "and a human looked at us and saw something that no one else has ever seen." Marcus felt every eye in the galaxy turn to him, and he wanted to shrink away, but he forced himself to stand straight, because this moment was bigger than his own discomfort. He did not see monsters, the matriarch continued, and he saw victims, and he saw a species that had been tortured and traumatized and transformed by horrors you cannot imagine, and he saw the truth that we have been hiding even from ourselves. She lowered her head slightly, and her voice grew softer. 3,000 years ago, we were prey, she said, and we were hunted and bred and slaughtered by a species called the Kethre, and for 600 years we existed only as food. The chamber went absolutely silent, and Marcus watched as understanding began to dawn on face after alien face. "We became what you see because we had no choice," she continued, "and we evolved into nightmares because nightmares cannot be eaten, and we forgot how to be anything else because the fear was all we had left." The Thalani representative stepped forward, and her blue face was twisted with conflicting emotions. "You destroyed our colonies," she said, "and you killed millions of our people." "Yes," the matriarch replied, "and because you attacked us first, and because when you saw us coming, you launched strikes against our fleet, and because we had learned that the only way to survive was to destroy anyone who threatened us. But we attacked because we knew what you would do," the Thalani protested, "and we attacked because everyone knew the Vexari would destroy us anyway, and we destroyed you because we knew you would attack." The matriarch replied, "And because everyone knew that all species attacked the Vexari. And do you see the circle we have all been trapped in?" Marcus watched as the weight of that realization spread through the assembly, and he saw ancient certainties crumbling, and he saw the first cracks forming in walls that had stood for thousands of years. The Crix representative made a clicking sound that the translator rendered as grief. "We never asked," she said, "and we never wondered why you were as you were, and we simply assumed you were evil." Everyone assumed. The matriarch agreed, and because it was easier than asking questions, and because monsters do not deserve understanding. She turned to look at Marcus, and her voice carried clearly across every channel. "But this human asked," she said, "and this fragile old male from a species we had never encountered looked at me and saw a person instead of a nightmare. And he offered something that no one has offered us in 3,000 years. "What did he offer?" the Nebulon representative asked, and its gaseous form swirled with curiosity. The matriarch was quiet for a moment. "He offered to help us remember what we were before the fear," she said, "and he offered to teach us how to be something other than monsters, and he offered us family." The word hung in the air, and Marcus could see it affecting the assembled representatives in ways He had not expected, and he realized that perhaps the Vexori were not the only ones who had forgotten what it meant to truly see another species. The matriarch drew herself up to her full height once more. The Vexori will not integrate humanity, she announced, and we will not consume them or destroy them or add them to our collective relief. And shock rippled through the assembly. Instead, the matriarch continued, and we ask for the first time in our history to be integrated ourselves. The chamber erupted in chaos, and voices overlapped as representatives demanded explanations and accused the matriarch of deception and insisted that this must be some kind of trick. But Marcus watched the matriarch, and he saw no deception in her many eyes, and he saw only exhaustion and hope and a desperate need to believe that change was possible. We asked to learn, she said over the noise, and we asked to be taught how to be neighbors instead of nightmares, and we asked for a chance to become what we were before the Kethre took everything from us. She looked at Marcus, and her voice dropped too. Something almost gentle. This human showed us that it is possible to see past the surface, she said, and he showed us that understanding can exist, even between the most different of beings, and he reminded us that we chose to become what we are, and that means we can choose again. The chaos slowly subsided, and Marcus could see the representatives looking at each other with new eyes, and he could see ancient hatreds warring with something that might have been hope. The vain representative stepped forward again, and her voice was uncertain. How do we know this is real? She asked. And how do we know you will not turn on us the moment we lower our guard? You do not, the matriarch replied simply, and you have no guarantee and no proof, and nothing but our word and the word of one human who was brave enough to look at us without fear. She gestured toward Marcus. But he trusted us, she said, and he came to us alone and unarmed, and he gave us a chance before we had done anything to earn it, and perhaps that is how trust begins. Marcus cleared his throat, and every eye turned to him on earth. He said, and we have a saying that trust is built one moment at a time, and one choice at a time, and one act of faith at a time. He looked around at all those alien faces and all that history and all that pain. The Vexari have taken the first step, he continued, and they have admitted their pain and asked for help, and that is harder than any battle they have ever fought. And now the question is whether the rest of us are brave enough to take the next step. The chamber was silent, and Marcus could feel the weight of the moment, and he knew that the next few seconds would determine the future of the galaxy. Then the Thalani representative did something that shocked everyone. She bowed to the matriarch. We will try, she said, and we do not know if we can forgive, but we will try. One by one, other representatives stepped forward and offered the same uncertain commitment, and Marcus watched as walls that had stood for millennia began to crumble, and he thought about Sarah and how proud she would have been to see this moment. The matriarch turned to him and made a gesture that he somehow understood was a bow. Thank you, she said, and you have given us something we never thought we would have again. What is that? Marcus asked. Hope, she replied. And in that chamber, surrounded by the representatives of 100 civilizations, Marcus Chen smiled and allowed himself to believe that maybe, just maybe, humanity had done something truly good. Years later, when the historians wrote about this moment, they would call it the beginning of the Third Galactic Age, and they would build statues and monuments and write songs about the day. An old human looked at a monster and saw a friend, but Marcus never cared about any of that. He only cared that somewhere, out among the stars, a species that had forgotten how to be anything but afraid was finally learning to hope again, and that was enough. That was more than enough. The end.